David Peterson sat back in his leather chair, staring out of his office window at the busy streets of Portland, Oregon. At 42, he had achieved everything he'd set out to do. A successful director of marketing at one of the top advertising firms in the city, he had the perfect job. His life was smooth, predictable, and filled with the kind of comforts he never thought possible. He had a beautiful home, a thriving career, and, most importantly, a wife who seemed to be everything he ever wanted. Karen, his rock, his partner. They had been married for 12 years, and in all that time, they'd built a life that many envied. She was a successful lawyer, a powerhouse at her firm, and someone who could command a room the moment she walked in. Her confidence was contagious, and it complemented his more reserved, thoughtful nature. Together they seemed like the perfect couple. Their social life was always busy, dinners with friends, gallery openings, and the occasional concert. They reveled in the culture of the city, often spending weekends wandering through art galleries or attending live music events. For all the years they had been married, life had felt easy, almost effortless. They understood each other deeply, shared the same values, and had a mutual respect for one another's careers and ambitions. There was never a shortage of things to talk about or experiences to share. But over the last few months, something had started to change. It wasn't drastic at first, just small things that David had brushed off as the natural ebb and flow of life. Karen, the woman who used to come home after work excited to share stories about her day, had become more distant. She was still the same confident and driven person, but there was an underlying shift. Her hours at the law firm grew longer, and she began returning home late, claiming she was working on complicated cases. But David could sense there was something more to it than that. It wasn't just the late nights. He noticed how Karen had started pulling away in other ways. Conversations, once deep and filled with laughter, now felt shallow. There was a coldness in the way she answered his questions, and when they did talk, it often felt like a chore. On some nights, she would sit at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging his presence. It was as though a veil had descended between them, and no matter how much he tried to break through, it remained intact. David wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about this felt wrong. The more time passed, the more unsettled he became. The woman he had married seemed to be slipping away from him, and no matter how much he reached out, she remained out of his grasp. One evening after dinner, David noticed Karen once again on her phone. This wasn't unusual. She often spent time on it, checking emails or chatting with colleagues. But tonight there was something different. She seemed more engrossed than usual, her eyes glued to the screen as her fingers tapped away rapidly. He could sense a tension in the air, but he chose not to confront her. Instead, he took a deep breath and decided to wait. He tried to remind himself that he was just being paranoid. He had no reason to doubt her, no evidence to suggest anything was wrong. The next day, as David sat at his desk, the gnawing feeling that something was off refused to let go. Karen had left for a client meeting, a routine that had become more frequent in recent weeks. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to her strange behavior. The way she had been avoiding eye contact. The way she'd been glued to her phone. The distance between them that seemed to be growing with each passing day. It was then that an idea struck him. One that made his stomach churn with unease. David wasn't one to invade privacy, but a small voice inside him urged him to check the location-sharing app on their phones. It was a tool they had set up years ago, mostly for convenience, knowing where each other was in case of an emergency or for simple coordination. At the time it seemed harmless. But now, with the growing suspicion gnawing at him, he felt a strange sense of urgency. He opened the app. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Karen's location. She wasn't at the client meeting as she had said. No, she was in the Pearl District, across town, far from where she should be. A sense of dread swept over him as he stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Without a second thought, David grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He didn't know what he would find or if he was just jumping to conclusions. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he drove toward the location, his mind raced. The Pearl District was a lively area full of restaurants, shops, and apartment buildings. He had no idea what Karen could possibly be doing there, and the thought of confronting her left him with a mixture of anger and anxiety. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he approached the address. When he arrived, his heart sank. Karen's car was parked outside an apartment building. He sat in his car for a moment, staring at the building, trying to gather his thoughts. Part of him wanted to leave, to drive away and forget what he had seen. But another part of him, one that couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling in his chest, urged him to go inside and face whatever it was that had been slowly unraveling their marriage. Taking a deep breath, David stepped out of the car and made his way to the entrance of the building. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building in his chest with each step. When he reached the door, he hesitated for just a moment before knocking softly. The door opened and David was greeted by a man he didn't recognize. Daniel, he would later learn, was Karen's colleague. The look on Daniel's face when he saw David standing there was one of pure shock. Behind him, Karen appeared, her face going pale as she saw her husband standing in the doorway. David's heart shattered in that instant. The truth was clear now, even without the need for words. His wife, the woman he trusted with everything, was in this apartment with another man. David felt the anger and heartbreak rise within him, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or lash out. He simply stared at them both, his face cold and unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "So, this is what you've been doing?" His words were soft, but they felt like a punch to the gut. Without waiting for an answer, David turned and walked out, leaving behind the woman he thought he knew, the life he thought he had, and everything that had once seemed so perfect. The days that followed felt like a blur for David. The world he once knew, the life he had spent years building, unraveled in a matter of hours. The calm and predictable existence he had grown accustomed to now felt like a distant memory, a dream that had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. After that night there was no going back. David had confronted Karen, if you could even call it that. There was no screaming match, no desperate pleas for forgiveness, just an overwhelming silence. Karen had not offered any explanation, only a look of guilt mixed with fear. She didn't chase him when he left, didn't attempt to justify her actions. That, in itself, was perhaps the most painful part of it all. The absence of remorse, the cold indifference to the devastation she had caused, left David questioning everything. In the days after, the house they shared no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison, a constant reminder of betrayal. The echo of their empty conversations, the quiet moments that used to be filled with shared laughter and understanding, now seemed haunting. He spent his nights pacing the house, his mind racing through a million thoughts, none of which brought any relief. David found himself retreating into his work, trying to drown out the pain that clawed at him every waking moment. He focused on his projects, making sure that nothing at the office slipped through the cracks. He had to, if only to maintain some semblance of control over his life. The distractions didn't last long though. Every time his phone rang or an email came through, his mind would drift back to that night. He would see Karen's face, pale with shock, and Daniel's surprised expression when he opened the door. It all felt surreal, like a bad dream that refused to end. At home, the silence between them grew louder. Karen no longer stayed late at work as she had in the past. Instead, she would come home, often with a look of shame in her eyes, but she never spoke of what had happened. David didn't know what to say either. How could he? What words could possibly bridge the gap between them now? Their marriage, once so full of promise and love, had become a hollow shell of what it had been. One evening, David found himself alone in the kitchen, stirring a cup of tea. He glanced at the empty chair across from him, the chair where Karen used to sit, laughing about her latest legal victory or talking about some trivial matter that now felt so distant. The empty space felt suffocating, as if the air around him had thickened with every passing second. David tried to focus on the mundane details of daily life, but nothing felt normal anymore. He avoided Karen whenever she was home, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say. Every word felt like it would pierce through him, and every glance felt like a reminder of the trust that had been shattered. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house only grew. Karen no longer tried to engage with him. She would retreat to her study or spend hours in the living room, reading or scrolling through her phone. David didn't know if it was guilt or something else that kept her from talking to him, but he knew one thing: the woman he had married was no longer the same person. One evening, as David was working late in his office, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it quickly. It was from Karen. "We need to talk." David stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He had imagined this moment countless times in his head, but now that it was real, he didn't know if he was ready. What could Karen possibly say that would make any difference? Could anything she said make up for the destruction she had caused? He stared at the message until the words began to blur. His thoughts swirled, a whirlwind of confusion, pain, and resignation. Finally, he stood up and walked out of his office, heading toward the living room where Karen sat on the couch, her eyes focused on the screen of her phone. Without saying a word, David sat down across from her. The air between them was thick, the silence so heavy it was almost suffocating. Karen put down her phone and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, and there was something vulnerable in them that David hadn't seen in a long time. "I know we need to talk," Karen said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know where to start, David. I don't know what to say." David's heart ached at the sight of her, but he remained stoic. He wanted to say something, to yell, to demand answers, but he had no words. Instead, he just stared at her, waiting. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't plan for things to spiral out of control," Karen continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I've hurt you more than you can imagine. And I'm sorry. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make things right." David let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her words, but also feeling the finality of it all. He had spent months trying to ignore the signs, trying to convince himself that things would get better. But deep down he knew that nothing could erase the betrayal, not really. "I don't know if there is anything you can say, Karen," David replied softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I don't know if I can forgive you." The words hung in the air, heavy with the reality of their situation. Karen didn't respond. She simply nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and for a moment, David thought she might reach out to him, but she didn't. Instead, the silence stretched on, thicker than ever, as they both sat there, trapped in a moment that neither of them could escape. David stood up without another word, turning away from the woman who had once been his world. He didn't know what would happen next or what the future held for them, but one thing was clear. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The following days were a blur of tense silences and unspoken words. David felt the weight of Karen's apology, but the damage had already been done. The distance between them had grown so vast that no amount of remorse could bridge it. It was like a chasm, one that had opened between them without warning, swallowing up everything they had once shared. The house that had once felt like a home now felt more like a place of ghosts. David went through the motions of daily life, but everything seemed hollow. He had always been a man of routine. Work in the morning, dinner in the evening, and weekends spent with Karen exploring the city or relaxing at home. Now those routines felt pointless, like the empty gestures they had become. The silence at the dinner table was deafening. Where once they had shared stories of their days, now there was only the clinking of silverware and the sound of Karen's occasional sighs as she stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. David avoided confrontation. He wasn't the type of person to make a scene or demand answers when he didn't have the strength to hear them. But he also knew that avoiding it wouldn't change anything. Karen's betrayal lingered between them, and no matter how many times she apologized, he couldn't simply erase it from his heart. Trust, once shattered, could never be fully repaired. A week after their conversation, David made the decision. It wasn't something he had come to lightly, but he had known, deep down, that this was the only way forward. He had been thinking about it for days, about what the future could hold for him, and he had come to a painful conclusion. He had to leave. The decision to file for divorce wasn't easy. It felt like a defeat, a surrender to something he didn't want to accept. But he knew there was no other way. Their marriage was over, even if the words hadn't yet been spoken aloud. In some ways they had both known for a while. The moments of intimacy, the shared glances, the laughter, those things had all faded long before the affair came to light. What was left between them was nothing but the ashes of something that had once burned bright. David called his lawyer. He didn't need to say much. The lawyer understood immediately. They discussed the details, the division of assets, the living arrangements, and, most importantly, the separation. Karen would move out. It was the only solution that made sense, even if it broke his heart. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and logistics. David didn't want to think about the specifics, but he couldn't help it. He had to prepare for a future without Karen. That meant finding a new place to live, moving his things out of their home, and starting over. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and love, now felt like a tomb. David could hear the echo of every conversation they had had, every happy moment they had shared, and it only made the decision more painful. But he couldn't stay. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when he knew in his heart it wasn't. The night before he was scheduled to move out, Karen approached him in the living room. She had been quiet for days, and David had almost forgotten what it was like to be in the same room with her without the weight of betrayal hanging over them. "David, she began, but her voice cracked and she hesitated. David looked up from the box he was packing, his heart heavy with emotion. He didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to listen to her try to explain away the unexplainable. But she deserved to have her say, even if it didn't change anything. "I know this is hard," Karen continued, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know I can't take back what I did. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. From the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry. I've ruined everything, David. and I hate myself for it." David looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had heard these words so many times now, but they no longer carried the weight they once did. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that her apology was genuine, but he couldn't. Not anymore. "I'm sorry too," David replied, his voice steady. "But sorry isn't enough, Karen. It never was. What you did, what we've become, it can't be fixed by words. I can't live like this. Not anymore." There was a long pause between them, both of them standing there, the space between them filled with so much unsaid. Finally, Karen nodded, her eyes closing as if accepting the truth of his words. "I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I understand, David. I wish I could have done things differently." David didn't say anything else. He couldn't. There were no more words left to say, no more explanations that could undo the damage. In that moment, he realized that they had both known this was coming, even if they hadn't admitted it until now. The next morning, David moved out of the house that had once been their home. He packed the last of his belongings into the back of his car and left behind the life he had known for 12 years. As he drove away, he felt a strange mix of emptiness and relief. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was free. For the first time in months, David felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The house, the marriage, the years of trying to fix something that was beyond repair, all of it was gone. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he would do next, but for the first time in a long time, David felt as though he had the power to choose his path. David's new apartment was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from the bustling streets and the memories of his life with Karen. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom with minimal furniture, but it was his. It was a space that belonged to him alone, a fresh start after everything he had lost. The walls were bare, the air filled with the scent of fresh paint. There were no echoes of laughter or the shared hum of life that had filled his old home, but that was okay. In the silence, David could finally hear his own thoughts, the ones that had been drowned out by the noise of his marriage for years. The first few weeks in his new apartment were strange. David had always been someone who thrived on routine, on the comfort of familiarity. But now there was nothing familiar. The small tasks, the quiet moments, they all felt different. But, in a way, that was what he needed. He needed to feel the disorientation, to let go of the life he had been holding on to so tightly. His work became a welcome distraction. In the past, he had been consumed by his career, but now it took on a new significance. Without the emotional weight of his marriage hanging over him, he found that he could throw himself into his projects with more clarity, more energy than he had in years. His colleagues noticed the change. David was more present, more focused. His creative ideas flowed effortlessly, and he was once again excelling in his role. But success at work wasn't enough to fill the emptiness he felt. Despite the long hours at the office, despite the new apartment and the freedom it offered, there was still a hole inside him. He missed the companionship. He missed having someone to talk to at the end of the day. But what he had learned was that the loneliness he felt was part of the process. It was a reminder that, in order to move forward, he had to sit with the discomfort and allow himself to grieve. Over the months that followed, David started to settle into his new life. He explored Portland, rediscovering places he hadn't visited in years, places that once held meaning but now felt fresh and new. He started taking long walks in the evenings, giving himself time to think and reflect. He joined a local gym not just to stay fit, but to meet new people and challenge himself in ways he hadn't before. Slowly he began to rebuild himself, piece by piece. Karen had tried to reach out a few times. The first time, a few weeks after he moved out, she called him, leaving a voicemail full of apologies. She sounded as though she was struggling, her voice shaky, desperate. But David couldn't bring himself to call her back. He had to let go. He couldn't keep holding on to a person who had betrayed him. Each time she called, each time she sent a message, David ignored it. It wasn't out of spite, it was out of necessity. He needed to protect himself, to heal. And that meant cutting off the ties that bound him to a past that was no longer his. One afternoon, while having lunch at a local cafe, David received a message from his lawyer. It was a brief note, but it confirmed what he had been expecting. The divorce was final. Karen had agreed to the terms without contest. There was no more reason to hold on to the legal ties that had bound them together. Their marriage, in every sense, was officially over. David sat back in his chair, staring at the message on his phone. The finality of it settled in, and he felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It was done. The life he had known, the love he had given, the trust he had placed in Karen, those things were gone. But in their place was something new, something that held the potential for growth and change. For the first time in a long time, David allowed himself to think about what the future could hold. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need to. What mattered now was that he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. He had learned that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something to cultivate, to nurture, and to build from the ground up. And right now that was what he was doing. One evening, as the sun set behind the Cascade Range, David stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below him, a sea of possibilities. He had come so far, and while the road ahead was uncertain, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. David no longer needed to hold on to the past. It had shaped him, yes, but it would not define him. He was no longer the man caught in the web of a broken marriage, clinging to a love that had faded. He was free. And for the first time in months he smiled. The future was his to shape. And he was ready.